What is tag? Reverend Dr. Sorum, in his paper The Reason for Reason, argues that the transcendental argument for the existence of God, tag, is the only coherent answer regarding fundamental epistemological axioms. He states, tag, not to be confused with a God of the gaps argument, a fallacy, simply removes all objections and excuses for not believing in God. Tag is a presuppositional argument and critiques the presuppositions of other worldviews. Since everyone presupposes something, e.g., pre-commitment to logic, reason, evidence, and making arguments, no one is presuppositionally neutral when it comes to factual questions and experience. Before analyzing tag, we must distinguish between two key concepts, universals and particulars, also known as first-order and second-order knowledge. Particulars, or first-order knowledge, these are based on direct empirical experience. When I see a wooden pencil and say, this is a pencil, I am categorizing an object based on its characteristics, wood, graphite, and rubber, without questioning whether pencilness is a real universal property or a human construct. Universals, or second order knowledge. This involves the claim that I have knowledge that this is a pencil, implying that pencilness is not merely a human concept but an objective reality. Tag essentially claims, I have knowledge that I have knowledge, moving from assumption to universal certainty. It argues that knowledge exists as an objective universal reality and that no other meta-epistemological framework is coherent. However, Tag does not merely claim alternative frameworks are flawed, it asserts that they are impossible. This strict claim is where Tag's weaknesses begin to show. If an alternative, such as necessitarianism, can be shown to be both possible and coherent, Tag is significantly weakened. This leads to my thesis. Tag claims that God is the necessary precondition for knowledge. However, this relies on two key assumptions. One, that Tag is the only coherent explanation for knowledge, and two, that God possesses both absolute power and free will. If an alternative framework, such as necessitarianism, is coherent, and if Tag fails to resolve contradictions between God's absolute power and free will, then Tag is substantially weakened. If a Tag proponent accepts my criticism, for the sake of argument, they will likely demand an alternative model explaining how knowledge can be justified without a creator. This brings me to my second point, the coherence of necessitarianism and the rejection of both accidentalism and divine epistemology. The problem of God and modal logic. Philosopher Dr. Amy Karofsky presents necessitarianism as the view that nothing about the world could have been otherwise. Her critique of theism's modal properties raises significant challenges for Tag. She argues, if God determines modalities, possibility and necessity, then it seems that he can do anything. But if God can do anything, then he can change any necessity into a mere contingency, which entails that there is no real necessity at all. It becomes arbitrary. If, on the other hand, God's actions are restricted by prior necessary laws and principles, then he is not genuinely omnipotent and free. Since Tag argues that God is the necessary precondition for the possibility of knowledge rather than its necessity, it implies that God could have chosen whether or not to create logic. This leads to a dilemma. 1. If logic is contingent on God's will, then logical truths, such as the law of non-contradiction, are arbitrary rather than necessary, contradicting Tag's claim that logic is objective and unchanging. 2. If logic is not contingent on God's will, then logic exists necessarily and independently of God, which undermines Tag's claim that knowledge depends on God. This also suggests that logic binds God, limiting his free will. Divine conceptualism attempts to resolve this dilemma by claiming that logic is a necessary aspect of God's nature rather than a product of his will. However, this does not escape the fundamental problem. If logic necessarily follows from God's nature, then God's actions are determined by that nature, meaning he does not have liberation free will. Conversely, if God is free in the liberation sense, then he must have been able to choose different logical principles, making them contingent rather than necessary. Either logic is arbitrary or God's nature is constrained. Both outcomes weaken Tag's foundations, i.e., God's free will and the objective nature regarding the laws of logic. Some Tag proponents, such as Sorum in an Orthodox theory of knowledge, attempt to resolve this by also presenting the argument using propositional or disjunctive logic. However, this weakens Tag by making God's existence dependent on logic rather than the other way around, denying him the possibility of creating knowledge itself. Conclusion. If logic is contingent, it is arbitrary. If it is necessary, it exists independently of God, contradicting Tag's core premise. These problems significantly weaken Tag's claims and open the door for alternative explanations of epistemology. If logic exists apart from God, then God is not the necessary foundation of rationality, contradicting Tag's claim. But if logic is created by God, then it's contingent and arbitrary, undermining its supposed necessity. If God's nature includes logic and morality as necessary aspects, then God cannot choose otherwise. His actions are determined by his nature. This means God's free will is constrained, making him less than omnipotent. But if God can act against his nature, i.e., violate logic or morality, then his nature isn't truly perfect, and logic/morality become arbitrary, defeating the whole point of tag. So, if God is bound by logic and or morality, then God is not all powerful. Or, if God is not bound by logic or morality, then logic or morality are arbitrary. Autonomous epistemology versus divine epistemology. In The Reason for Reason, Sorum argues that there are only two distinct meta-epistemological views. One, autonomous epistemology, frameworks such as coherentism, natural theology, and foundationalism, which Sorum dismisses as accidental. Or two, divine epistemology, the view that knowledge must be divinely guided. Sorum critiques autonomous epistemology by stating, the problem isn't simply that second-order beliefs require justification, but rather that first-order epistemic models can never be justified on any autonomous model because they always result in either trivial tautologies or vicious circularity. He argues that non-theistic epistemology presupposes accident, leading to incoherence. In this story, you have accidental knowledge, accidental meaning, accidental laws, and accidental logic, oxymorons that are self-defeating. Since knowledge, meaning, laws, and logic preclude accident in their definitions, the non-theist view cannot justify any of its assumptions about the world, knowledge, arguments, laws, and logic. It assumes a theistic view of purpose and intentionality to even discuss these things. However, if necessitarianism, a deterministic framework where nothing could have been otherwise, is coherent, it challenges Tag's exclusivity. This would reduce Tag from a necessary explanation to an alternative with a broader landscape of possibilities, much like how Newtonian mechanics remained valid but incomplete after Einstein introduced relativity. The coherence of necessitarianism. As stated earlier, necessitarianism is the view that absolutely nothing about the world could have been otherwise in any way whatsoever. The transcendental argument for God often revolves around the existence of knowledge. If one argues against Tag, they are implicitly assuming that knowledge is real and attainable. Tag proponents frequently counter with a challenge. You're assuming the laws of logic are true by presenting an argument. How do you justify the existence of knowledge and the validity of the laws of logic? This line of questioning often forces non-theists to defend a non-theistic axiom, with responses ranging from an endorsement of accidentalism to an admission of uncertainty or indifference. Necessitarianism rejects both accidentalism and the notion of a deity with free will, such as the Christian God. It avoids the realm of contingencies, unlike contingentarianism. For example, if I place a glass on a table, a contingentarian would argue that I had a choice in the matter, that at the moment of holding the glass, numerous possibilities existed, such as dropping it or throwing it. A contingentarian would justify this claim by referencing factors like neural activity or involuntary muscle movements. Most people adhere to this view of metaphysical causality, where events unfold according to statistical likelihood rather than strict necessity. However, necessitarianism posits a different perspective. It rejects the idea that events occur merely due to statistical probabilities. Instead, it asserts that everything happens as it must, with no alternative possibilities. Any claim to the contrary bears the burden of proof to explain why things could have been different rather than being as they are. To illustrate this position, I refer to Karofsky's Spinoza-style argument from her book A Case for Necessitarianism, which states that necessity and contingency are absolute categories, even in the presence of an omnipotent being. This aligns with Father Sorum's disjunctive argument of accidental or divine. Karofsky articulates, for example, say that there is a law that holds of necessity in this world but is such that it could have failed to obtain, perhaps because the initial conditions of this world could have been different or because it does not obtain in some other possible world. Because such a law obtains but might not have, the law is contingent, even if it holds necessarily in this world. Similarly, say God exists and has free will in the sense that he could have chosen to create a different world from this one, or could have created different entities. Because God could have made a different choice than was actually made, God could have been otherwise, in that way, making him contingent, even if he has some necessary features. This contingency and necessity are absolute. Each entity is either necessary and unchangeable in every way, or contingent and changeable in some respect. From this, it follows that if God could have made different choices, he would not be the same God that exists now, as we would be living in a different world under different circumstances. This presents two possibilities. Either one, our circumstances are contingent on God's will, implying that his will is not immutable, thus making God himself contingent and non eternal, or two, God's decisions are necessary, meaning he cannot choose freely but is bound by necessity. In other words, God must either be a contingent being subject to change or a necessary being void of free will. Why prefer necessitarianism over contingentarianism? Karofsky begins her case by highlighting the lack of empirical evidence supporting the claim that things could be otherwise. She states, Indeed, because it is impossible to experience what does not happen, there can be no experiential evidence for the contingency of anything. This argument is self-evident. While we can speculate about alternative possibilities, we lack observable evidence for the actual occurrence. Predictions about what could have happened remain hypothetical rather than empirical. Furthermore, contingentarians, both theistic and otherwise, often rely on unfounded assumptions. Many argue that possibilities exist simply because they are imaginable. However, I can imagine you not placing the cup on the table is not a valid justification for asserting that it was truly possible for events to have unfolded differently. Moreover, it is impossible to retroactively verify such claims. One common example of this fallacy is given by Karofsky in the form of an argument about a fictional man named Fred and his cat. Premise 1. Cats can be orange. Premise 2. Fred's cat is gray. Conclusion. Therefore, Fred's cat could have been orange. When the contingentarian assumption that orange is a contingent property is set aside, premise 1 merely expresses the fact that some cats are orange, a proposition that is true but that entails neither the contingency of a cat color nor the possibility that Fred's gray cat could have been orange. She further explains that reaching premise 2 from 1 presupposes the contingency of multiple factors, such as genetic makeup and inheritance patterns, without evidence. Since these assumptions are themselves contingentarian, they cannot be used to justify the contingency of Fred's cat's color. Instead, the only verifiable facts are that some cats are orange and that Fred's cat is gray. Nothing in this knowledge suggests that Fred's cat could have been any other color than gray. Furthermore, assuming that Fred's cat could have been a different color also assumes that its parents, grandparents, and prior genetic lineage could have had different genetic codes. This results in an infinite regress of unsupported assumptions. While one might attempt to resolve this issue by appealing to universals rather than particulars, Karofsky argues that this shift does not solve the problem. If the properties under consideration are universals, and the conclusion reached is that it is metaphysically possible that Fred's cat could have been orange, the argument fails for the reasons previously stated. The mere fact that universal properties are compatible does not entail that this particular cat could have been a particular orange rather than a particular gray. If, on the other hand, the properties are particular level properties, the argument still fails because it rests upon the contingentarian assumption that these properties can be co-instantiated, even in an object that currently lacks one or both of these properties. She concludes, when we take into account only actual objects with their actual properties and set aside any and all modal assumptions, what remains are the actual objects with their realized properties. The fact that some cats are orange does not provide experiential evidence that Fred's gray cat could have been orange without committing the existential quantification, possible instantiation fallacy. Conclusion. In summary, the existence of God or a necessary entity does not challenge arguments for necessitarianism. Imagining alternative possibilities does not justify their actual feasibility. Arguments based on particulars commit the existential quantification, possible instantiation fallacy. Arguments based on universals fail due to the absence of empirical evidence for non-actual but possibly actual worlds. At this point, a tag proponent might ask, how can knowledge exist in a world governed by necessity? The answer is straightforward. Knowledge necessarily exists because it must exist. The burden of proof now shifts to the attack proponent to demonstrate why knowledge must be contingent on God and or why knowledge exists specifically from a contingent God without creating a contradiction. If they claim that necessitarianism is incorrect, they must not only disprove it but also show that it is incoherent. If they can see that necessitarianism might be true, even by the slightest degree, then tag is significantly weakened.